Early in his career, Lloyd Blankfein was constantly judging the room and himself.
Who shall I be this time? How shall I sound this time?
He grew up in public housing in Brooklyn and arrived at Harvard feeling like an outsider. Then came the decision that would shape the way he carried himself for the rest of his career.
Somebody put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Lloyd, you may think you're changing, but everybody knows exactly who you are." And so I decided I might as well go with it because I'm not fooling anybody anyway.
For the future Goldman Sachs CEO, that meant stopping the performance and becoming more comfortable with who he was.
I think what's prized most in the world, whether people acknowledge it or not, is, authenticity.
But as he rose through the firm, Blankfein also had to learn another lesson.
To be a good teammate, you have to not only take criticism, but you have to be a little softer when you give it.
These are Lloyd Blankfein's executive decisions. Did you feel growing up and in your early years, whether it was at Harvard Law School, J. Aaron, did you feel like an outsider?
Well, I did. I wasn't a lot like my classmates. I came from public housing, and I went to Harvard, and I had roommates that had gone to private school. Yes, I was an outsider. I was a striver. And in my experience, when I meet other people who are in senior positions all over, if you unpack their stories, they kind of were that way too. I think it's helpful in some ways.
But from a very early age, you didn't let that become an issue. You didn't let that become something that kept you down. Actually, I think reading Streetwise, you used it to drive you on. Is that the case?
It did. And I always say it gives you perspective. It also delivers you a higher EQ, emotional quotient about people, because you learn to read the room better, because you're always very conscious, less about what you're communicating and really what the other person wants to have. You become a little bit more of a pleaser, and that helps you. In certain. I'm sure everything has a good side and a bad side. I'm sure it's burdensome in some ways and helpful in other ways, but can't help myself. This is I go into a room and I'm thinking, how am I being perceived? Conscious. You may not hear it as much as other people do. I have a kind of an outer borough, New York City kind of an accent. I once said, who shall I be, who shall I be this time? How shall I sound this time? And somebody put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Lloyd, you may think you're changing, but everybody knows exactly who you are." And so I decided I might as well go with it because I'm not fooling anybody anyway.
Yeah. Let me talk a bit about your earliest role models. And I think they maybe came from your family. You've got this amazing grandmother who you were living with at one stage as well. You've got your father who's worked in the post office, but a really hardworking guy and really helped drive you. And you've got your mum, you've got your sister as well, who is, I think, 8 years older than you.
9 years old, yes.
9 years older, and was just a phenomenal person in bringing you up as well. Were these the early mentors?
I hate to say it because it was such a good lead-in, but not really. From very early on, I really just wanted to get out of the neighborhood, get out of the context that I was in, go. And for me, the symbol was to go to an out-of-town school to get accepted. It would mean, in my case, having to get a scholarship and go to an out-of-town school. And my parents, who I really, really appreciated, had a much tougher life. The blue collar people, workers, laborers. My dad didn't have a lot of opportunity, so I appreciated them, but they really weren't that much of a role model for me because I was trying to get into a different role. You watch television, you see how other people live. I didn't know anybody who lived in a real house as opposed to an apartment in an apartment complex. But I aspired to all these things that you saw, and so I worked towards it.
So it was you that drove yourself, not anyone particular in your early childhood or your developing years?
I felt that way. I can't think of anybody who I aspired to be. I didn't know anybody growing up whose father went to work in a suit or wore a tie. I didn't have that stuff, so I always tried. I didn't affect that stuff. I just wanted to leave where I was.
I find that phenomenal. I've conducted 22, 23 executive decisions interviews now. People come from all kinds of backgrounds.
Sure.
One from a slum in Casablanca, another one from rural Kentucky where he was working in the garage at 13 and found it really tough. But they all had a mentor who said to him, "No, you can go and do this as well." So for you to get to Harvard and then Harvard Law School purely on the back of your own drive, that is quite an incredible thing.
Well, I'm here. So if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be talking. There'd be somebody else in this chair talking to you. I was always driven that way. Yes, I was. But I mean, it wasn't like, I think I had a perspective on it. I think I had a sense of humor. I think if it didn't work out, I would have adjusted to it. But I was encouraged by incremental success. And so I did well in school. And I had people who helped me along the way. My high school didn't have a college office that would prepare you to apply to colleges. I went to a different high school just to go to their college night, and there was somebody manning a booth who was representing Harvard, and he gave me an application, and he chatted with me, and I filled it out. I filled it out like you'd filled out a landing form when you were coming into a country. These were meant to be essays, and I just wrote it off my head, but I give the university a lot of credit because they found me. It's not done by statistics. They read your application, they give you an interview, and I'm lucky they saw something.
When did you decide you wanted to go to Harvard? It doesn't get more blue blood as opposed to blue collar.
I decided why I wanted to go to Harvard when I got into Harvard. I never saw it before. I just applied to all the brand name schools that I could. So it was a bunch of Ivy League schools, and then the State School of New York.
Was it Yale that turned you down, amongst others?
Yes, of course. I didn't get into all of them. To this day, I still have some admiration for them because they were smart enough. They turned me down. But I thought I would end up in a state school, which wouldn't have been so bad. And then freakishly, I got into a couple of these Ivy League schools, and that was a big moment, and there was a lot of apprehension associated with it. I hadn't met anybody who'd gone to a school like that, and when I went there, I'm sure my roommates and friends that I subsequently became friends thought I was a Martian, or someone from someplace far away, but it worked out.
But you yourself felt like you were trying to fit in. You were buying Lacoste t-shirts to fit in. You were trying to buy the right suit, the right sports jacket to fit in as well. And then when you were going to friends' homes, you were like, wow, this is phenomenal. I didn't know people lived like this. But when you brought them back, you felt very self-conscious, didn't you?
I did. And, and then I felt embarrassed with my friends. And then later in life, I felt embarrassed about having been embarrassed because that was terrible because I felt, was I being fair to my family and those feelings. And now I decided that I'm not going to be so hard on myself. And it's just a kind of a normal thing.
Right. I'm going to spin forward now. You've got your undergraduate degree at Harvard. You've done really well in Harvard Law School. You've moved on to a great company a little bit further down the line, Donovan Leisure. You're a successful, hardworking lawyer looking at kind of fairly dull areas, tax and what have you, and looking at the nuances of tax. But you've made it. Why on earth did you look to throw all that away and becoming a trader or a salesman at a small brokerage?
Commodity. Well, I was working at that job, but I didn't love the job. And for me, it was a chore. And so I said, and again, I was living in New York. New York is a very finance-oriented town. So I started applying for other jobs, and those were jobs in finance. I started interviewing at this small commodity trading firm called J. Aron. And then during this elongated interview process, Goldman acquired them. And that was lost on me. I didn't even observe that. And it didn't really matter for a few years because it operated separately for a long time. But I joined this company. They gave me a job, and it turns out, in hindsight, I found this afterwards, they hired 20 people in the hopes that they'll have 2 at the end. And it was a trading environment and, rough and tumbling. People were screaming at each other, waving their hands. And it was sort of like, believe me, that was an environment that I'd grown up in. And so I was quite comfortable with.
So you felt actually that your Brooklyn background, you'd kind of, I can do it. This is way better than law, just sitting there looking at complicated tax judgments as well.
Yeah, I wasn't as analytic as that. In hindsight, yes. At the time, I just said, this seems pretty good. And frankly, the hours were shorter. I mean, the one good thing about being a lawyer in those days is that the hours were so long, and sometimes there was a lot of drudgery associated with what you had to do, that almost any other job after that would be lighter and merrier, and would be a better lifestyle for a young associate trying to climb the law firm ladder. And so when I went there, it looked better in a lot of different ways. I didn't know if I'd be good at it, and it turned out it suited my personality.
You were 36 years at Goldman's, J. Aron. And it seems to me that you spent at least the first half of that career trying to justify the J. Aaron operation to what was a very well-established investment banking operation at Goldman Sachs. You guys were always pushing against a glass ceiling, or the Goldman's guys were on a better floor,
Right.
and you guys were in a different building, and you had to convince Goldman's that actually this was the way forward to become a bigger operation.
Well, there was a bit of a cultural difference between the firm J. Aaron that I joined, the relatively small commodity trading firm, which consisted of a lot of people who were streety. Not all of them had been to university. And it was people who would kind of work their way up. A good entry-level job at J. Aaron was to be the driver for one of the co-senior partners of the firm. So that shows you what kind of career path was in that firm, whereas Goldman Sachs was a very, very establishment kind of firm where people had graduated from all the Ivy League schools, and that was kind of the entry requirement to get a job at Goldman. So there was a little bit of upstairs, downstairs about Goldman Sachs and J. Aaron. Of course, I already had a chip on my shoulder, and that kind of really reinforced it. And so, yes, there was a little bit of trying to prove that we were good. And frankly, it didn't hurt us. Some of these things that you think of as burdens and disadvantages in the long run turn out to be advantages because we worked harder, took a little less for granted. We're much more curious about learning about stuff because we didn't think we knew everything.
Were you successful sometimes in spite of yourself? A little bit later on, you had to take on 360-degree performance reviews. And time again, people say that you were very combative, you didn't always listen to them, you talked over, sounds a bit like myself at work to be fair, but you talked over them. Did you, were you successful in spite of yourself sometimes?
I put in a review, this is a 360, like all, 20 different people, some report to you, some are over you, comment on you, and somehow they all came up with 20 synonyms for this guy really needs to change his behavior. Tough. I know people who are in very, very high senior places, and I think, boy, that person must have been voted most likely to succeed in kindergarten and every year since then. And there are some people who are later bloomers and who never thought of themselves. And I was sort of in that latter category. In my life, I've met some very, very accomplished, very, very smart people. But people throw the word genius around very, very easily. I've met people who've worked hard, who've done well, who had lucky opportunities, and give them credit. They took advantage of those opportunities, but they weren't geniuses. They just applied themselves. They had their ears open. They had curiosity about the environment around them, and they saw things, and they went through little doors that other people wouldn't have seen. And that's a point to make that a lot of these opportunities are more accessible than you think. If you think that someone can only get to this spot because he's brilliant and a genius and had this charmed life at every stage, you kind of give up. And so part of this thing, an objective is that my career is not only relatable, but accessible. Statistically, not a lot of people are going to get those kind of breaks, but you can go pretty far in this world, taking advantage of opportunities and working hard.
My own career in the city started very early on. I had a great role model, a man you probably know, Jeremy Isaacs, who went on to Lehman's, of course, and he was a great role model. And I still speak to Jeremy and get advice of him to this day. Who was the best of the best that you listen to and use as a role model when you were at Goldman's J. Aaron?
Yes, and it's funny, little things make very important impressions. So going back to my law firm days, when I first went to I said earlier, I never knew anybody who wore a suit. I went to the first boss I had in my law firm. This is the most useful things impossible. He told me how to dress better. I didn't know that you put little tabs in your collars to keep your collar down. I was waiting. He told me
you to go out and buy a few Hermes ties at one point.
Told me to buy these ties and not those ties. Save your money. No, don't buy 10 of those ties. Buy one or two of these. People take an interest in small ways, and those are the things that establish a good bond between people. I'm sure he taught me things related to the law. I probably would have learned those anyway.
I want to go to 1991. Robert Maxwell's ringing you up, one of the most important businessmen in the world. I want your advice, Lloyd, as well. You got a little bit flattered by him. Everyone got flattered by him. A couple of months later, he's passed. Maybe he fell off his boat. No one knows.
Pushed.
But he was a crook.
Right.
It turns out that Robert Maxwell was a crook. What did you learn from that relationship?
I learned, well, first of all, you're exactly right. I was kind of seduced. But even if somebody told me I was seduced, I'd have been flattered that he took the time to try to seduce me. At that point, I was a fairly junior person in the foreign exchange world. He was transacting himself But a lot of people did in those days involved in global markets, because, currencies were very volatile and decisions about currencies were quite consequential to business. And there was nothing that he did with me that was illegal or should necessarily have raised a big flag. But I realized that I was an unwitting instrument on his effort to take money from his public company and move it to his private companies, because he would do currency transactions and he'd give the back office payment terms that involved moving the money to a different source, which he was entitled to do. He was the CEO of both entities, and he was authorized to do it. But when this all came out, I realized, my God, I was so flattered by him, by the fact that he was calling me and that I was giving advice to the great man, that I realized that as you go up and you're in a position of influence or the ability to help people, you have to have a certain kind of reserve, because you can't allow yourself to be flattered in that way. You can't allow yourself to be manipulated and used. And the temptation, by the way, even among well-intended people who don't have fraud in their scope, might get you to do things that you don't want to do. And if you're a natural pleaser and so impressed by your own magnificence because these people want to befriend you, you'll do things that you shouldn't do. And so you learn in life, and I understand very senior people very often, especially in a banking world where you make credit decisions and you can finance someone or not finance them, and it's really existential for their lives, you have to have a certain kind of remoteness. And you can't be very, very good friends and always want to please the people you do business with, because you have to make, again, decisions that are in the best interest of the company and the greater world, and not necessarily in their interest.
Goldman slowly realized, got more and more partners on board, that you just needed more capital. You loved the culture. It was culture versus capital at one point. That was how it's framed by a lot of the partners. But you needed more capital. So you decided to IPO a portion of the company as well. That made you a stunningly rich man, didn't it? I think somewhere in the region of $90 million?
Well, we maybe have different thresholds for what's stunning. It certainly made me well.
Well, compared to where you are now, Lloyd, I appreciate that.
It certainly made me a lot wealthier, but I wasn't stunned by it at the time.
But, so the process to end the formal partnership and become a listed company as well, that was very interesting.
Yes, let me
tell me about that.
Goldman Sachs really prides its culture as a private partnership, and it really made a difference. Everyone was an owner of it. Everyone felt and owners are different than employees, because you feel entitled to information. You feel entitled to have influence. If the senior partner wants to do something, he really has to socialize and listen to comments, because you're dealing with your fellow owners. That makes sometimes processes are slower, but it makes the organization much more stable, and I think better in the long run. So people were very reluctant to give that up. We thought it was a special advantage of the firm, and I to this day I believe it was. It was partly the opportunity to do more stuff with more capital, but having survived some of those earlier crises, partnership is another thing also. It's impermanent capital compared to a corporation, which is permanent capital. You keep your balance sheet, you keep your capital. People can transact shares and get out of their position and leave the company, but the capital stays in the company.
But what is fascinating about that
it was too
moment,
dangerous to remain a private partnership.
And a lot of partners walked. And I think this tells a lot about you, if I may say so. Sure. I think you were stunningly wealthy, by the way, and I think you knew it because you know where you came from. You've never forgot East New York and Brooklyn as well. But a lot of the partners thought, I can do other things here. And a lot of them did. And they went into politics, you talk about, into all kinds of other things. I think one of them went into coaching.
They bought sports teams.
Yes. You stayed. So I think that does tell a lot about you and what drives you as well. Can you just expand on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the answer. I just am wired. I like what I was doing. People also left. Partly people left because they wanted to really to defend their wealth that they had acquired. And they could. Look, we all suffer. We all go to work every day and boss does something that annoys us. And guess what? You go home, you complain to your spouse, and then you come in the next day and you sort things out. But when you're well-to-do and you sort of get irritated at your boss, the next day you go in and you quit because you can. Keeping people at that point was a little bit different. People had leapfrogged in wealth. People had previous notions of what was wealthy, and somehow they leaped way beyond that. And so some people decided to leave. They were probably making the right decision for themselves. It wouldn't have been the right decision for me. What would I have done for the next 30 years? By the way, in old Goldman, it was always figured that people would stay, be a partner of the firm, and then leave when you still had more gas in the tank, more chapters left, if I mix a metaphor, more chapters left to perform.
But that's how, with your public speaking as well, you never want to speak too long. You want to leave them wanting more.
Yes, always leave them wanting more, and you make the opportunity for someone else. But people usually left the firm in their middle or 50s, and then they did something else. And every once in a while, somebody would stay too long, like me. When you became partner of the firm, the person that inducted you into the partnership would sit there and say, this is your expectations of you. This is what you have to do. This is your new role and your new station and a set of responsibilities, a role model for others. And he'd say, the expectation is you should organize your life. So if and when they write an obituary about you, no more than 3 or 4 paragraphs are about Goldman. You should do other things. By the way, you should do other things while you're working at Goldman. You should be philanthropic. You should be on the boards of certain charities. And, your career should end at a point at which you still do other things afterwards. And that was a very important part of the Goldman ethos.
In 2006, you became the CEO. You took over from Hank Paulson. You became his heir apparent. You were like the CEO. You like being the COO because you didn't have the same legal liabilities on the results statements as well. When did you make the decision, I'm going to be the CEO?
I became the COO, but working for somebody who was still youngish and still was going to stay in the firm for a longer time, short of being hit by a bus or something else. And then guess what happened? As happened to so many of my predecessors, he got tapped to be Secretary of Treasury, effectively finance minister of the country. So prior to that weekend, when he discussed with me that he was taking the job, I thought I would probably retire as his number 2. Wow. And yet, then,
you still didn't think you were going to be number 1?
I didn't think I was. I knew if there was a call for somebody else to replace him, it would probably be me at that point. But he was, he was young enough to do that job for a longer time. That would make me older than I should be to start in that role. And instead of working another 10 years in that job, he left that job. So I ended up being CEO of Goldman Sachs for almost 13 years.
That's a great quote, earlier quote. If I knew I was going to go so high in the firm, I would have been a lot nicer to people I met along the way. It would have saved a lot of time making up to them later on.
Oh, sure. Yes.
You had to change your personality a little bit as you got higher
As I
up.
got more senior, again, you had a chip on her shoulder, a certain amount of resentment of people who acted haughtier, and then we started to outperform. And, that the recognition of that outperformance lagged the actual outperformance. And then at times I had to remind them of, what was going on. I could be sarcastic. I was never much of a screamer, but I was very, very caustic. And it was very entertaining for a lot of people around, but not necessarily for the object of my sarcasm.
There's a lot of Lloydisms out there. Sorry, I know this is quote-orama. I am listening. This is a you in management committees. I am listening. I just hear faster than you talk. I mean,
no they
wonder
said,
people.
Why don't you let me?
No wonder people.
Right? Yes. Why? Somebody would say, why don't you let me finish before you disagree with me? And I said, look, you haven't said it, but I hear faster. I've already heard you in here. No, it was difficult. And again, I think we all get our personalities stamped at very young ages. You don't become a completely different person, but you can kind of lean against character, which I learned to do. And the fact of the matter is, I was tough on people, and the people I was tough on weren't immediately helpful to me thereafter. And why would they be and shouldn't be? I learned to be more self-deprecating. I learned I still had perspective. I still had a sense of humor, but I would stop myself before I made somebody else feel bad about it. And so I think I got a lot more better. But I think my basic character was I was very institutionally oriented. I grew up and I wasn't part of anything. I felt remote when I went to my fine university in my early stages in the firm. And when I sort of felt part of a big, important institution, I kind of hugged it. I kind of liked it. There's some people who are geared to be entrepreneurial and want to be themselves. They say they can't work for someone and they don't want to have partners who they have to. I wasn't that way. I like being affiliated with an institution. And to work well in an institution, you have to be a good teammate. To be a good teammate, you have to not only take criticism, but you have to be a little softer when you give it. And over time, I learned that. So I said, really, I made a good joke out of it, but it was actually true. I had to make peace with a lot of people who on my way up and their way up were kind of, didn't enjoy my sarcasm as much as I enjoyed delivering it, and I had to make peace with them. And they were right, and I was wrong.
But what went well in Brooklyn and East New York when you're growing up, and then worked really well on a trading floor as well, doesn't necessarily work in the same way when you're talking to top board members or politicians or blue bloods. Is what you kind of had to adapt quite a lot, didn't you?
You adapt, but look, at the end of the day, I think what's prized most in the world, whether people acknowledge it or not, is, authenticity. Yeah. I mean, I know who I am. It helps to have a high position because now I walk into a room and people, this is shocking to me. People are sometimes intimidated of me before they meet me. When you're CEO, you get taken around to people, and somebody at Goldman would say, "Oh, this person really thinks very, very highly of you and is looking forward to meeting me." And I'd say, "Gosh, if they think really highly of me, why ever would I meet them?" You can never be radically different from yourself. I would lean against certain tendencies, tendency to be sarcastic or snarky. Not at some point you realize, why would I have a chip on my shoulder? At this point, I'm a graduate of excellent schools. I've been the head of a very influential firm. I've mingled with a lot of very important. I think it's time to set that chip aside.
I don't know if I agree. I think if you're authentic and that's who you are, then that's who you are.
But even you have to acknowledge, even in your, also to be authentic is to acknowledge reality. And at some point, I remember when I was growing up, we were the recipients. My family was generally the recipients of other people's philanthropy. I went to my schools. I got free lunch in school. My college applications were free because our income was below a certain level. We lived in public housing, so rents were very low. And, that sticks with you. And then one day, you realize, my goodness, way before I was a partner of Goldman Sachs, at some point, that's kind of not only don't I need other people's help, but I should be giving help.
Lloyd, let me spend a bit of time talking about the GFC, a great financial crisis. Tell me a little bit about what good decisions you made in the face of what was an existential threat for the financial system and, dare I say it, for the global economy.
Well, the best set of decisions were really baked in. And in fact, it was the earlier crises that put us in a position because we became very, very, very aggressive. We were risk managers and processes. So we were always very conscious of risk. As Goldman's, we have a reputation as being risk takers and doing well in good times and not suffering as much in bad times. But we instituted a lot of processes. The most important one was we marked our securities, our balance sheet to market very rigorously, very religiously, very often. And so other people didn't. We would mark to market AAA securities that were always presumed to be worth 100 cents on the dollar forever, but we would not only market to market, we would test it in the market by having people go out and sell them and seeing if there was truly a market to it, as opposed to marking things to models or marking things to analogies to other instruments. And that religious marking to market all the time gave us an early warning sign that something was amiss in the world. And when the financial crisis started to go and it affected kind of the weakest part of the mortgage market, subprime, even people like Ben Bernanke and other great, central bankers said, well, this is a temporary phenomenon, transient. I agreed with that this didn't look like it was become as big as we know it ultimately became. But we said something is going on here. Let's bring our risk down. Let's stay closer to home was the language that we always use. So traders and risk takers and market makers continued to make markets. If clients wanted to buy something, we sold it to them. If they wanted to sell to us, we bought from them. Sometimes we'd be long, sometimes we'd be short, these kinds of instruments. But we kept it bounded within a very tighter range than we normally would, because we just saw that things were in flux, even though we didn't know what the outcomes.
So you were well prepared. Can you think of a pivotal decision you made in the heat that actually was the best decision you made in that crisis?
We had to be very, fleet of foot. There were things happening all the time. Every weekend, the government was putting in a new protocol, a new set of rules and guidelines. And so incrementally, we were always preparing, trying to stay ahead of it. What could happen next? How could things get worse? And we had rooms of people who were going out and kind of wargaming the next scenario. We didn't always get it right, but it made us much more prepared, to the point where people thought we were successful in anticipating things. We were just very good contingency planners. Another thing that we did that was, I don't know whether you call this a decision. Really, what I needed to do is get everybody to do their jobs and not to be kind of frozen by what was going on. You turn on the TV and it was like they were watching, it was like a sporting event that was going badly.
Yeah. It's interesting you should talk about sport, because a great cricketer, whether it's or even a baseball hitter, they see the ball large and they see it slow when they're on form as well. How did you feel in the depths of this crisis? Did you feel a sense of calm?
I mean, I was as nervous and as rattled as anyone, but I didn't have the luxury of being able to perform that way. Think of an analogy, you're on an airplane and the flight attendant, is having a beatific smile. Now I'm thinking, sometimes I look at that person, I'm saying, is she rattled? Now, I don't mind turbulence, but I'm very carefully attuned to the sounds of the engine, as long as those sound the same. But every once in a while, it sounds a little different to me. And I look at her face or his face and I go, if they look terrified, I would be terrified. But instead, it's that beatific smile and calm. And your position requires it. And so you do that. I've never been in combat or in war, but I imagine, when things are going off, if you don't have your sense of responsibility kind of displaces, your anxieties and fears in a way, if you're wired that way. And I was kind of wired that way. And so keeping the firm on, I wouldn't say it was an even keel in that period, but as even a keel as could be accomplished was a very, very important thing to do.
Lloyd Blankfein, it's been an honor and a privilege. I've wanted to chat for you for years, and that's a big part of my career pluses now. So thank you very much.
Steve, thank you. I enjoyed it. I wish it were longer.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
What could I learn from Lloyd Blankfein in this interview? A legendary Wall Street figure. His career has been well documented, not least by himself in his extensive biography. He's divisive. Some think he's the ultimate example of a fat cat Wall Street bankers. Others laud him. Say, look what this man did in the great financial crisis, negotiating Goldman's and the financial system to some form of safety. What I really learned is he was a street fighter, a man who came from a blue-collar, tough working background, the projects in Brooklyn, dragged himself up through Harvard Law School, J. Aaron, Goldman Sachs, and perhaps did it by sheer force of will. He saw himself as an outsider. He saw himself almost with a chip on his shoulder, fighting against the system. It's an amazing story of someone who made good. It is a very relatable story for many people. Thank you very much indeed for joining me on the show we call Executive Decisions. I would love to hear your feedback. Please drop your thoughts in the comments or a review. And please hit that follow or subscribe button. On the next episode, I'll be speaking to the CEO of Reed Group, James Reed.
But I think that's a vital part of being an entrepreneur. You have to keep trying things. And the worst decision would be to stop trying things.
I'm looking forward to it. We'll see you then.